I'm Karen Odden, and this is the story behind my story.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Karen Odden.
Thanks for tuning in to Author Stories today. It's November and we have lots of great shows for you. Author interviews, writing advice, the very best people in writing today. Join me each and every weekday. You can find all of the archives at hankgarner.com. Before we get started, let's talk about some sponsors today. Writing novels is hard, but Dabble makes it easier. Dabble replaces your word processor, doing what it can't. Dabble organizes your manuscript, story notes, and plot. It simplifies story, leaving more room in your brain to create. And after all, that is what being a writer is all about. Dabble was built from the ground up specifically for writing novels. It takes minutes to learn, and it makes writing a joy. See how Dabble will revolutionize the way you write with a free trial at www.dabblewriter.com. Also, thanks to our friend Mindy Tarquini and her book, Deepest Blue. From critically acclaimed author Mindy Tarquini comes a magical tale told sun to sun, moon to moon, heart to heart, and midsummer to midsummer. For fans of Paulo Coelho and Neil Gaiman, in an enchanted city seen only at twilight, a resentful second son unlocks secrets which could cause his world's star to finally set. Publishers Weekly calls Deepest Blue a haunting, lyrical fantasy dealing with love, loss, and political turmoil. Kirkus Reviews said there's a lot to like about Tarquini's Italian-inflected fantasy story, starting with her often lyrical prose. Deepest Blue by Mindy Tarquini. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. I'm excited to have author Karen Odden on the show with me today. And Karen is the author of a brand new book. When you're hearing this, it has just released. It's called A Dangerous Duet. And this book is full of mystery and intrigue and romance. And it's a great period piece. So I'm excited to talk about it today. Welcome to the show, Karen.
Thank you so much for having me.
Karen, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Well, I do remember it. I nearly burned the house down.
Oh, my goodness.
That's part of the reason why I remember it.
This is going to be good.
Yeah. So I was about 6 or 7 years old and lived in a house up in upstate New York. I had my own bedroom, and my bedroom had a walk-in closet. And it was one of those great walk-in closets, like 8 foot by 8 foot, the clothes kind of hanging away so that you could kind of sit in the corner. It was great. And that's where I used to go to read. So one day I walked into my bedroom and I decided I was going to iron some of my doll clothes. And I had a real working iron, and it was sort of the right size for doll clothes. It was maybe 5 inches tall. It had an enamel blue handle. I had a little ironing board. So I plugged it in. You can see where this is going, right? And I went into my closet, and there were some books there that I'd forgotten I had. Because I think I had ordered them. Do you remember those Scholastic book inserts?
Oh, yeah.
That you brought home from school? You know, they were kind of on the cheap newsprint with the florid colors and everything. So I had some books in there, and I grabbed one while I was going to wait for the iron to warm up, and I sat down and I started reading it. And it was the book Golden Cloud. Were you a horse kid growing up at all?
Yes.
Okay, so this book was, I think, written in the 1950s, and it's about a young boy, if I remember correctly, from Detroit or Chicago, and he goes to this ranch in the middle of America, somewhere, Oklahoma or something. And he's wild for horses, and he apprentices himself basically to the ranch owner, and he at some point foils a nefarious scheme to steal a horse, and as a result, the ranch owner gives him the horse. As you can imagine, this appealed to my 7-year-old sensibilities, and I sat down, and I was in a big horse phase. You have to understand. I mean, I had read Black Beauty half a dozen times. I'd read all of my dad's Black Stallion books. I wanted nothing more than to be left on an island somewhere with a horse and some carriaging. Like, I was just all into that. And so I wrote what I guess now would be called fan fiction. I wrote a 20-line poem about Golden Cloud. And it was truly dreadful. And I think it was in rhyming couplets. One of the lines was something like, when your tail is swishing, I know what you are wishing. And, it's bad, right? I was 7.
But it was earnest.
Crazy about horses. It was very earnest. Yes. It was very earnest. And I think, though, at that moment, I realized that I wanted to participate. I wanted to be one of the people in this group of writers that was making people love horses and feel excited about horses. I don't think I ever did anything with the poem. I think I, stuck in a notebook or something somewhere. But that was my first memory of, I want to do this, just like this author did. I want to make people excited about it.
So was the house saved?
And then my mother called me for dinner, and sorry?
I was going to say, was the house saved? But you go ahead. Your mother called you for
dinner. Yes, so my mother called me for dinner, and I came out of the closet and saw the iron, and in one of those heart-stopping moments of, oh my God, when you realize you've done something stupid, I went over and I pulled the plug out quickly, and I picked up the iron, and by that point, even the enamel handle was hot, and I burned my hand that day. But the house did not burn down, and I went on to dinner. So.
Wow. Well, that's one of those indelible memories that's just there with you. Did your parents recognize this storytelling gene in you?
Yeah, I think that they did. My grandmother certainly knew that I loved to read, because every Christmas she would give me books. And she had a huge library of her own, of sort of floor-to-ceiling books at her house, and she had everything in there. That was where I first read Mary Stuart. It's where I encountered my first bodice ripper. Lots of mysteries. She was always into those. And but she gave me, for Christmas, she gave me the whole Anne of Green Gables series, all of the Little Women books. And some of those old, like those classic YA books, pardon me, you're stepping on my eyeball, Tunes for a Small Harmonica. So she was really good about that. But on Sundays, we would always go over to her house. And on the way home, it was always dark, after dinner. And I had 3 younger siblings, and we would all be in the back seat of the station wagon. And sometimes I would tell stories. And I remember one night telling a story to my sisters, and my parents, I could sense that they were sitting in the front seat looking at each other like, this is actually sort of interesting. So I think that they did recognize that it was my sort of way of passing time. Right. Yeah.
As you got older and you discovered these new books and new genres, and your horizons were expanded, at what point did you realize that you had a place in this world? Like, we all have that desire when we're young to do this thing and to make these things that make people happy and all of that. But then there seems to be an awakening of sorts at some point where someone says, okay, this is not necessarily something that I want to do anymore. This is something that I will do. And there becomes a new resolve. What was that experience like for you?
Oh, gosh. I think, as with a lot of authors, there's so many fumbles at the beginning, so many bad novels that we write and stick in a drawer, and story ideas that we start halfway and then throw out because we realize they're not going anywhere, or the initial impulse is lost. About 5 years ago now, I think, I had written a book that eventually became Lady in the Smoke, but my first book, which was published in March of 2016. And I'd written a version of it, and I had people read it, some friends read it, and they said parts of it are really good, but it's kind of slow to get going and that kind of thing. And I remember thinking, I'd sent chapters out to agents and always gotten rejections and all this kind of thing. And I remember being with a friend of mine, Jody, whose last name is Hallam, and is actually the reason that I took up Hallam as my inspector's name. It's also a nice English name. But she said, what do you think about getting someone to help edit the book and get it in the best shape possible? And around the same time, another friend of mine who had gone to a workshop recently and had run into somebody who was doing freelance editing passed me her name, Maisie Cochran, and she works for Tin House now. And I contacted her, and she helped me put the book together. And at the end of it, she said, I really think this has legs. I really think that this is in good shape. And sure enough, I sent it out, and some people were interested in it. And I think that was the first glimmer of, okay, maybe this isn't just me scribbling in notebooks, which I've been doing for 30 years, and writing really bad mysteries. So I think that was sort of the beginning of feeling. I think it's that moment when you touch somebody else, I guess, who you imagine to be in the inner circle, and they're saying, yeah, it's got potential, that you start beginning to think, okay, maybe. And then I found an agent, and a few more fumbles later, various, yes, we want it, no, we don't want it kind of things. And then eventually it was picked up by Random House Alibi, their ebook branch.
Nice. Something that I find really interesting is you have a PhD in English literature. Is that right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And even with going through all of the education and being immersed in literature the way you would have been, you still needed that extra set of eyes, that other voice, to take a critical look at your work and to help you see the things that you could not see, and maybe to help you think of things in a different way. That's what a good editor not only cleans up the mistakes that we eventually just begin to look over because we're so familiar with the work, but they help us to take a critical eye that we can't do for ourselves. First off, what led you to this career path and this education path, and would you like to speak to that about the fact that it doesn't matter how immersed we are in the scene, in the culture, in the work of it, still needing that extra voice and that extra set of eyes to help us with our work?
I would say that most of the writers I know agree that it is always helpful to have more people. And I know that some people have said to me, well, don't you feel upset when someone criticizes your work? And my feeling is, oh God, no, it's a gift, because I would much rather hear it now than have it get published and then hear it later. Do you know what I'm saying? I feel like anybody who's going to take 3 or 4 or 5 hours out of their life and read a few chapters and take the time to critique it is giving me something very precious. So I deeply appreciate all the people who have ever read anything and given me feedback. And I think that my difficulties were along the lines of, how do I craft a narrative that shows a character and begins in the right spot? Because for example, with Lady in the Smoke, at the end of chapter 1, there's a train wreck. And that's what starts the whole entire book in motion. It starts the investigation in motion. It starts her mother's illness in motion. Everything starts there, on somewhere around page, 15. And when I first wrote the book, the train wreck appeared in chapter 8. So that gives you an idea of what one of my issues was. I was writing my way in, and I didn't quite know where the story itself began. And what's come around as kind of interesting and has occurred to me recently as I've been reflecting on that is I am deeply interested in backstories. And it is part of the reason that I think I'm drawn to writing mysteries. Because if mystery is really all backstory. If you have a dead body on page 5, the next 300 pages are how did the dead body get there?
Exactly.
You know what I'm saying? So I feel like backstory is so crucial to it. And so when I think about Lady in the Smoke in its very first incarnation, which had those first 8 chapters, those first 8 chapters are important. They don't need to be in the book, but they need to be in my head while I'm writing.
Right. Absolutely. And I think authors are really interested in backstory for that very reason that we know things about characters that the reader may never know, but those things influence what a character does, how they behave, the ultimate plot unfolding. And like you said, they don't necessarily need to be in the book, but they have to be in the author's head. And I really like that's learning what needs to stay in your head and what needs to be on the page. That's a great gift that someone can give you for sure. What led you to study English and English literature and do this for a profession?
Oh, well, undergraduate, I thought I was going to be a doctor. And I think a lot of people went into the bio major thinking they were going to be doctors. And about 2/3 the way through my college career, I had to do a vivisection on a rabbit. So it was under anesthesia, but still, it's the same thing was I. And I thought, I don't like this. I really don't enjoy this. This is not my thing. And at the time I was taking a creative writing class that I had picked up, and I loved that. I found myself spending most of my time doing that instead of my biology class, my chemistry class, and my animal physiology class. And so when I graduated, I applied for programs, PhD programs in English. And I ended up at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, for about a year, and I did my master's. And after that, I realized I was not ready for graduate school. I was young. I was 21, and some of the other people in my program were, frankly, just more mature, better read. They had more of a critical grounding than I did. They were just more familiar with that kind of language, the kind of discourse, the kinds of conversations we were having. Anyway, so I stopped the program and took about 5 or 6 years off. I did marketing, I did sales, I worked for Christie's Auction House in New York. And eventually, somewhere around age 28 or so, I was talking to someone and said, I'd really love to go back for the PhD. She said, well, I don't mean to be, rude, but when do you think you're going to do this? Like, don't you think you should get started? And so we were in New York at the time. My husband was up at Columbia. And so I applied to the three or four New York area schools and ended up in NYU. And I happened to have a phenomenal teacher freshman year who was teaching a Victorian novel class. And I sort of got sucked in, and then that became my period. And so when I went on to do my dissertation, I wrote it on representations of railway disasters in Victorian novels, poems, the medical literature, the parliamentary papers, the newspaper articles, the gravestones, anything I could find. And there was a lot of it because a lot of people were talking about railways because they were really the first modern disaster. And they were also the first tort cases. They were just highly publicized. They were all over the courts at the time. So I sort of got sucked into that Victorian period, and now I tend to place all of my books there because I feel like it's a really interesting historical period. The women are just beginning to agitate for the vote. The middle class is beginning to get the vote, men, of course, only. And there's a lot of legislation being passed about children, about women's rights, about property, what women are and are not allowed to own. There's a lot of conflict between the newspapers and the police at the time. Scotland Yard is still not respected. People are vaguely suspicious of plainclothesmen who can circulate without us knowing who they are. So there's a lot of really good stuff in the 1870s. It's a great period to write about.
Well, and it seems to be just ripe with subject matter to tell stories that are still very impactful today, but to couch them in maybe things we're more comfortable with. So maybe we can tell stories about the way the world is today, but by setting it in the Victorian era, we're able to highlight things that maybe ease us into talking about things. Does that make sense?
Exactly. Yes. I completely agree. If you keep them sort of historically at a distance, you can bring them thematically close. And things like women's rights or discrimination or cruelty or a lack of empathy, these are all things that we may have feelings about in today's world, but by putting it into a book that's set 100 and some years before, it creates enough of a distance that people can talk about it as, I don't know, in a different way.
What are some of the challenges in writing in that era, other than the obvious things of maybe technology that, you have to be mindful of making sure you get some of those details right. But what are some of the challenges of writing in a period where the world is very similar today in a lot of ways, but the way of life is so different?
Well, I think part of the challenge is just the enormous amount of reading and research. Oftentimes when I'm writing, I'm also reading some Trollope or some Dickens or some Mary Elizabeth Braddon, so that I have even just the objects of the day and the sort of the flow of the language and the vocabulary in my head as I'm writing. And those books are all, of course, Trollope, I don't think he wrote anything under 500 pages.
Right.
So there's this, that kind of like, you're kind of intensely taking in a lot of information and then, trying to sort of turn around and use it. The internet is fabulous because you can find a lot of things there. And every so often you get lucky. For example, with Dangerous Duet, back in 2012, my husband was taking a trip to London for work, and I tagged along. And I knew that there was one remaining Victorian music hall, one still standing, and it's called Wilton's, and it's in Grace's Lane down by the water. And have you seen Sherlock Holmes' Game of Shadows with Jude Law and Robert Downey Jr.? Okay, the scene where they're being chased by that sort of acrobatic guy through a musical, that's Wilton's. So they still use it for a lot. They've also, they filmed a whole bunch of things there. I think part of Danish Girl was filmed there. There have been some music videos and things like that filmed. It's a beautiful space. But I wanted to go and see it. And so I went to Wilton's when it was open, and I asked the building manager, hey, can I prowl around? He said, sure, take pictures of anything you want, whatever. And this is before social media, so the photographs I have are really just to help me remember what things looked like, not so much to post on Twitter or something. But I went back to them and printed them out and put them up in front of me as I was working, because you can see the plaster falling off the bricks. You can see the uneven floors. You can see the staircase that kind of twisted and went sideways a little bit at one point, and you can see the uneven floorboards and the U-shaped music hall. And that was lucky. That was one of those things that, what's lucky about writing in this period is there is enough, if you prowl around the streets of London, to find some of these things that give you the textures and the feel and the smells of the 1870s. And frankly, the basement of Wilton's had a very particular smell that I still remember. It was kind of a rusty, musty, metallic smell that trying to work in the book. But when I was standing there at the back of that music hall, looking at the room, it was sort of the first time I could envision Nell sitting there on the piano with the piano over on stage right. So that was just sort of a lucky moment. But writing in the 1870s, you don't get a lot of them, but when they do happen, you just feel very fortunate.
And it really is those little pieces of ornamentation, a smell, a particular mood of lighting. Those things are what really suck you into the story more so than the big flowery descriptions. It's those little things that make you feel like you're there.
Yes. Yeah.
So let's talk about the new book, A Dangerous Duet. This is set in the Victorian era. You mentioned your main character, Nell. What is Nell up to, and how does she enter the story?
Well, Nell wants to attend the Royal Academy of Music in London. She's a pianist, and her tutor that she'd had for several years passed away. And so now she wants to try to attend the Royal Academy. The problem is she needs money for tuition. And so she decides she's going to earn it. And there aren't a whole lot of options for young women in Victorian England to earn money. But she knows she can play piano and she can sight read. So she goes over to the music halls in Soho. And I didn't realize it until I started researching, but there were hundreds of music halls in London. I mean, all different kinds, little ones, big ones. They also had them up in Manchester. They had them in Leeds. And it was, I guess, sort of the way we'd attend movie theaters today. But so she goes over there and she finds out that dressed as a woman, she gets paid 10 shillings a week to play piano. But dressed as a man, she would get paid 20 shillings a week. So she goes out, buys herself some men's clothes, heads back, and she gets a job at the Octavian, which is based on Milton's. And she's playing there for a few months. She's made a few friends. One of them is Marceline, who's a trapeze artist. She and her brother have a trapeze act that they brought over from France several years before. And one of them is Stephen, who's a brand new violinist at the Octavian that night, and one of them is Jack, who's the son of the owner. And so that's sort of how she gets into that world. And her whole idea is to earn enough money so that she can go to the Royal Academy in the fall.
And she, because she is not willing to disguise herself as a man, her opportunities are less than if she would. Is that right?
Well, she does disguise herself as a man.
Oh, yeah. That's what. Yeah, that's what I meant to say. That they would have been. Right. So where does the mystery and intrigue come into the story?
Well, the very first night that the book began. I mean, she's been playing for months at the hall, but the very first night, she's on her way home and she's running late because she stopped to talk to Stephen, the new violinist, afterwards. And she decides, instead of taking her usual well-lit route back home to Mayfair, she takes a shortcut, and it's kind of dark and empty. And she stumbles over someone who cries out in pain. And it turns out to be her friend Marceline. And so that's kind of the initial moment. She has to get Marceline into a cab, get her to a hospital, and the story begins really with her just trying to help Marceline get in touch with her brother Sebastian, because he, of course, is going to be worried sick about her, and she doesn't know where he is, and she doesn't even know if he's alive or if something similar has happened to her. She's been sort of beaten and left for dead. So that's the beginning of the story, and that's what gets Nell into a sense, kind of begins to create that sense of danger. And then as the story progresses, she begins to realize that there are other things besides musical theater and such going on at the Octavian.
When a new book starts taking shape for you as the writer, what comes to you first? Is it a character like Nell? Is it a setting like the music hall? Is it a plot device? That this woman having to disguise herself and enter into a world where things happen, and then which one of those pieces comes first?
I would say probably the situation, it's the what if question. To some extent, this book took shape around Fanny Dickens, Charles's older sister, who went to the Royal Academy in the 1820s and studied with someone who had actually studied with Beethoven. She was a phenomenal pianist, but she got tuition money that Charles Dickens, being younger, did not get, which is why he ended up in the bootblack factory and all kinds of other things. But this, I thought, well, what would happen if she didn't have money? What would happen if her father, said, no, sorry, you're incredibly talented, but no, we don't have the money for this. So it's sort of that what if question, I guess, is that begins the book. And then Nell took place, sort of took shape around that.
Historical fiction is really hot right now. There over the last year, just so many books that have delved into this time period and then a little closer to us. But there seems to be a real fascination with people revisiting times in the past and near past to maybe try to reconnect with ideas or times that have gone. What do you think it is that fascinates us so much about looking back and reliving some of these people's stories with them?
Well, I would say I have a couple thoughts about that. One of them is that I was at a presentation for another author, Susan Elliott McNeil, and her books are all set in World War II. And someone made the comment that there's a lot of books about World War II coming out right now. And there's a new one that I'm actually just finishing reading the advanced copy of, Kate Quinn's new one called The Huntress.
Yes.
But things like, they're all, World War II, I think, is a really rich place. But one of the people pointed out something that I hadn't kind of thought of before, which is that in World War II, there was someone who was undeniably the villain. There was there was a little bit more of a black and white picture there than some of the grayer areas that are some of the other wars that we've had since then. And so the person's comment, I think, was something along the lines of World War II was the last time we were sure who the villain was. And I think that is often, in some ways, very reassuring, that we can identify a villain there that is not us and who could be conquered. I think that's a very reassuring idea. And the world right now is very gray and messy.
Yes.
I think
it's a very diplomatic way of saying that. Yeah.
And so I think that sometimes when we go back to those periods where things felt, in retrospect, whether they were or weren't, more black and white, I think that's sometimes why people have a hankering for those stories. But sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, do you think the Victorian era is a great place to visit because we can see how much progress we've made, or maybe see how much progress is yet to be made?
Yeah, there might be a little bit of the let's pat ourselves on the back because we're no longer stepping up a horse manure on the street sort of kind of feeling.
Right.
But I think the reason that I dive back that far is there was so much flux. The reform acts that were being passed, that all of a sudden people who couldn't vote for years and years and years, and now all of a sudden they can vote. the women who could not enter university all of a sudden are able to enter university. And I think that too in its own way is very reassuring to us, to know that there's always change coming and people are always pushing one way or another, and that oftentimes progress does get made, even though it seemed like there was an intractable situation. There are changes being made, sometimes slowly, and oftentimes through legislation, frankly. So that's fed by public opinion. And so I think that that's maybe why, for example, shows like Victoria, I know is popular. I've seen a few of those, but I think a lot of shows that are set in the Victorian era have both of those components. We can sort of pat ourselves on the back and say, okay, well, we've made progress, but also it's reassuring to see how difficult progress is, how fraught it is. And like, well, we're kind of in the middle of it again. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And you've taken a time that is so fraught with all that and written a beautiful story in the midst of it. A Dangerous Duet is out everywhere now when people are hearing this. Karen, if people are just learning about you and getting familiar with you and your work, is there a place online where they can find you and dig into your other work and follow news of what's coming next?
Yes, I have a website. It's just www.karenodden, and that's ODDEN.com. And I have a blog there that has a bunch of historical pieces about railways and pianos and music halls and that kind of thing. And I also have a Twitter account, so it's at Karen_Odden.
Excellent. We'll put links to those in the show notes at hankgarner.com. Karen, I love the book. I love what you're doing. We're going to send everybody to pick up a copy of it. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. You can find archives of all of the shows at hankgarner.com, and when you're there, please subscribe. Up next is an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Jason yanked the coils of safety rope to one shoulder and heaved them out the attic window. The bundle bounced over the roofline and dropped to the yard below. He tightened the harness, making sure the shoulder straps were snug over his sweatshirt. He threaded his rope through the braking device, tested it, and clipped everything to the carabiner at his navel. So far, so good. Fireman Mike would be proud. His stomach flipped as he neared the octagonal window. Had he tied the correct knots? Would he get himself killed? Weeks had passed since Mike's tutorial but he had to attempt the break-in now, while both Van Brunts were at the Christmas Eve service. He swung his legs through the window and felt for the roof. His sneakers gripped the shingles and he wriggled out, grateful for once to have feet as big as snowshoes. He pulled on a ski mask and sang, "Spider-Man, Spider-Man, does whatever a spider can." He lowered his body. Wind punched him in the jaw like a supervillain, surprising him. His sweatshirt rode up and snow burrowed into his navel. He looked down but couldn't see his feet. He relaxed his hands and put a few ounces of weight on the rope. Clots of snow broke away, dove over the edge, and took far too long to hit ground. He drew his rope around the pipe and pulled tight. Now he could drop. No, you will not drop. You will rappel. You will rappel very safely. He backed towards the edge, towards the point of no return. The backyard lurched into view. It was a 4-story fall, and he'd probably hit the stairs on the way down. He sledded helplessly. His legs fell, swung, and kicked the side of the house. Alarm bells went off in his head. He gripped the rope. It looked like nothing. A shoelace. Jason Crane, you're a damn fool. He went limp and fell over. The rope gave a jolt, and the harness tried to castrate him. He twisted, trying to save his poor descendants. He began to spin. His arm bashed through a row of icicles. The spin slowed, reversed, and at last he came to a stop with his back to the house, dangling over the backyard. "Thank you, rope. That's a good rope. Well done." He tried to turn around, but couldn't. With patience, he worked out a method of kicking in circles and managed to press his sneakers to the side of the house. He needed slack. He gathered his loose rope to the small of his back and disengaged the brake. Zip! He fell fast, all his weight on the rope now. His feet, planted, shot up over his head. The brake caught him, and the rope vibrated as wildly as a guitar string striking a note of panic. Jason heard a crunching sound and looked up. The leaf gutter crumpled and poured a stream of bitter ice water into his eyes. He snarled and wiped his face, dripping humiliation. Jason rested a moment and stared at his reflection in the glass. He was an enormous Macy's balloon drifting over New Jersey, tethered at the navel like underdog. How the hell did you get up here, kid? He did an awkward split, one foot above the window and the other below, hanging sideways with his weight on one hip. He closed his eyes and reached for the sill, crouching against the side of the house. His fingernails found the weather stripping, and he tugged. Locked. He cursed and tugged again, anger rising. He grabbed the frame with both hands and pulled with all his spider strength. Something popped. The window rose and the curtains splashed out. Jason dove headfirst into the fabric, wriggled and kicked, let out some rope and fell with a whump into his archenemy's lair.